Mark Carney has just sent one of the strongest public messages to Donald Trump since returning to politics. A calm but unmistakable "don't test us" delivered right in the middle of an international forum. And the way he did it was classic Carney, measured, strategic, and sharp enough that Trump's team will immediately understand who the message was meant for.
So what's your game plan for managing Mr. Trump?
Wow, okay. Look at the 21 minutes. I'll be able to swing that, stretch this out.
It's time for another adjacent answer.
Exactly. No, the game, but look, I think the first thing is one, respect, but not obsequiousness, right?
Prime Minister Mark Carney didn't need to shout, provoke, or stage a confrontation. In a rare, unusually candid conversation about managing world leaders, Carney delivered something far more potent than a diplomatic answer. He issued a subtle but unmistakably firm warning to Washington. Canada will cooperate, but Canada will not submit. Not after a year of unpredictable tariffs, not after months of economic coercion, and not in an era where the United States has become a destabilizing force in the global trading system. This was the first time Carney publicly described how he manages Trump, and the tone was sharper than anything we have heard from a Canadian Prime Minister in years. Speaking in Sydney during a public forum at the Lowy Institute, Carney was asked, "What's your game plan for managing Mr. Trump?" Most expected a cautious, diplomatic reply. Instead, Carney laid out a philosophy of leadership that simultaneously acknowledged Trump's power and rejected the idea that Canada must bend to it. He stressed respect, but not obsequiousness. In other words, the age of Canadian leaders quietly absorbing American pressure is over. Carney then explained that Trump responds best to direct and consistent communication in private. But the real message came when he described the importance of choosing public words carefully and not making claims you cannot back up. It was a gentle reminder that Canada will no longer be pushed around through televised threats or surprise tariff announcements. The conversation shifted when Carney described his first meeting with Xi Jinping. Xi told him, in essence, "Don't lecture me, don't grandstand in public, and don't escalate in front of an audience. Bring issues privately and deal with them directly." By repeating this story on a Western stage, Carney made it clear he expects the same principle to apply in all directions, including south of the border. From there, he outlined Canada's reset with China, its renewed partnership with India, and its deepening strategic ties with Australia. The implication was unmistakable. Canada is diversifying away from unpredictable partners. And without saying the name United States, everyone understood exactly which partner had become unreliable.
Monetizing their current indispensable position in a variety of economic relationships, virtually all economic relationships. You can do that for a time, but you can't do that forever. Because the reaction, and we're seeing it start to play out, is people need to diversify.
Carney's remarks land in a moment when Canada has already absorbed months of economic shock from Trump's second-term agenda. Tariffs have disrupted Ontario's auto industry, reshaped investment flows, and triggered consumer boycotts across both borders. The trade relationship that once accounted for hundreds of billions annually suddenly operates under political threat. Against this backdrop, Carney's tone marked a shift. He was no longer speaking like the head of a country trying to appease a volatile neighbor. He was speaking like a leader who is building insulation economically, diplomatically, and strategically against American unpredictability. His line about respect but not obsequiousness wasn't rhetorical flourish. It was a declaration that Canada will not play a subordinate role when the United States chooses chaos over stability. Carney's approach signals a Canada that is no longer willing to rely on U.S. goodwill to protect supply chains or national interests. Instead, he is constructing leverage and doing so in a way that Trump cannot easily counter. Carney made this clear when he walked through Canada's new partnerships. Australia has become a central pillar, with cooperation stretching from critical minerals and clean energy to naval security and AI. This matters because minerals like lithium and nickel are the backbone of the technologies that define this decade. By aligning with Australia, Canada helps shape a non-US industrial base that can operate even when Washington destabilizes markets with sudden tariff swings. Then there is India, now the world's fastest-growing major economy. After a period of diplomatic tension, Carney's visit produced a complete reset. Both sides fast-tracked trade discussions, expanded defense dialogue, and explored major cooperation in clean energy and advanced technology. For Canada, this opens a path toward Asian markets without relying on American approval. For India, it reduces dependence on China while strengthening ties with a G7 democracy. On China, Carney was remarkably pragmatic. He pointed out that Canada's economic integration with China is far lower than that of many Western countries, which gives Ottawa more flexibility. Cooperation will focus on areas where the risk is low and the benefit high, such as agriculture or selective clean energy cooperation. The lesson is simple. Canada is not aligning with China. Canada is diversifying and doing so in a way that reduces its exposure to U.S. volatility. Together, these moves create a quiet revolution in Canadian foreign policy. Canada is building an alliance web that no longer centers on Washington. For Trump, who has used tariffs and threats as tools of influence, this is a strategic setback. For Canada, it is a long overdue liberation.
Carney also made an unusually direct point about defense. Canada will double military spending and reach 5% of GDP by 2035, with enormous investment in cyber defense, AI systems, maritime security, and infrastructure resilience. This is not symbolic spending meant to satisfy NATO speeches. It is a structural redesign of Canadian security. For decades, American governments have used defense dependence as leverage in trade negotiations. A more self-sufficient Canadian military reduces that leverage. It ensures that Canada can defend the Arctic, protect Pacific corridors, and operate alongside allies like Australia and Japan without needing U.S. permission or hardware. Trump's strategy has always relied on pressure points. Carney is quietly removing them.
Trump thrives on drama, spectacle, and public confrontation. Carney's strategy rejects all three. By handling disagreements privately, speaking moderately in public, and building alliances behind the scenes, Carney makes it harder for Trump to gain political advantage by attacking Canada. Instead of feeding the spectacle, Carney deprives it of oxygen. This is not weakness, it is insulation. It is how you manage an unpredictable superpower without letting your country get dragged into the chaos. Carney's remarks were far more than a diplomatic anecdote. They marked the arrival of a new Canadian posture, confident, independent, and unwilling to be pressured by any great power, including the United States. His message to Trump was delivered without theatrics, but it was unmistakable. Canada will respect America, but Canada will not be bullied. Not on trade, not on strategy, not on national sovereignty. And the deeper question now is whether Washington realizes what is slipping away. Because while Trump repeats his old tactics, Canada is building new alliances, expanding its defense capability, and anchoring itself in a world no longer defined by American dominance. For the first time in decades, Canada is not waiting for U.S. leadership. Canada is setting its own course, and the United States will have to adjust.
The federal government has approved a massive shakeup in the mining world. London-based Anglo American has received federal approval to acquire Teck Resources, making two major mining giants one in a $70 billion merger. Anglo Teck is set to have headquarters in Vancouver, and Premier David Eby says it'll be the largest company in BC history.
So we're creating a Canadian giant. That's what we're doing. This was a net benefit for Canada. And why am I using the expression net benefit? Because it was my job under the Investment Canada Act to see whether it was a net benefit.
Canada has just pulled off one of the boldest economic moves of the decade.
In a single decision, Ottawa approved a $70 billion mining merger that instantly created what Industry Minister Melanie Joly proudly calls a Canadian giant. It is a global critical minerals powerhouse rooted not in London, not in New York, but permanently anchored in Vancouver. At a moment when Donald Trump is reshaping North American trade with tariffs and pressure politics, Canada has taken the opposite route. Instead of reacting, it has built something big, something permanent, and something that positions the country as a central player in the global minerals race. This week's announcement finalized the merger between Anglo-American and Teck Resources, two massive players in the resource world. Together, they form one of the most influential copper and critical mineral companies on the planet. But what made headlines across Canada wasn't just the scale of the deal. It was the conditions Ottawa imposed, conditions that rewrote the rulebook for foreign investment in this country. Minister Joly confirmed that the global headquarters will sit in Vancouver and that senior leadership functions will remain firmly under Canadian jurisdiction. She stressed that 2/3 of the company's decision-makers will live and work in Canada, paying Canadian taxes and overseeing global operations from Canadian soil. She also guaranteed that half the board will be Canadian for the first 7 years, then at least a third permanently. Those conditions reshape the typical story Canadians are used to hearing. This isn't another case of a proud Canadian company disappearing into a foreign parent. It's the opposite. Foreign capital being pulled into Canada, with Canadian rules, Canadian leadership, and Canadian benefits at the forefront. And the commitments don't stop at governance. More than 4,000 jobs are protected. Nearly 3,000 new ones are coming, and billions of dollars in new investment are already committed to British Columbia's Northwest, a region positioned to become one of North America's most important mineral corridors. What makes the moment even striking is the timing. Prime Minister Mark Carney has been pushing a national strategy built around economic sovereignty, diversification, and reducing dependence on the United States, all while Trump's second-term tariff agenda throws cross-border trade into uncertainty. Joly herself put it plainly in her interview: "We are diminishing our overdependence on the United States." In Canadian politics, that is as close as one gets to a declaration of independence. Canada's approval of this merger is more than a business story. It is a political and geopolitical statement, a signal that Ottawa is ready to play hardball in a world increasingly shaped by resource scarcity, great power rivalry, and economic nationalism. For decades, Canada watched its own companies get swallowed up by foreign buyers, often with weak conditions and few long-term guarantees. This time, the government flipped the dynamic completely. Foreign investment is welcome, but only if it builds Canadian capacity rather than hollowing it out. The most important piece of this puzzle is copper. In the era of electric vehicles, battery storage, data center expansion, AI infrastructure, and upgraded power grids, copper has become the backbone of industrial modernization. Demand is skyrocketing, and forecasts show chronic shortages worldwide. Whoever controls copper supply and processing will shape global supply chains for decades. This merger gives Canada something it has rarely had: genuine corporate muscle in a mineral that major economies desperately need. That immediately raises the question: how will the United States respond? Trump's tariffs have already weakened trust in the stability of U.S. policy. American manufacturers, particularly in autos and clean tech, depend heavily on Canadian minerals. And yet, the White House continues to push a strategy that corners allies into choosing the U.S. or facing penalties. Ottawa is clearly no longer willing to put all its eggs in the American basket. Instead, it is building the structural foundation for long-term autonomy. A mining giant headquartered in Vancouver gives Canada leverage, bargaining power, and global reach that no tariff threat can easily undermine. This also changes Canada's position in the competition with China. Beijing dominates much of the global refining chain. It controls a massive share of processing capacity for copper, lithium, cobalt, and rare earths.
Western countries, especially G7 leaders, have been scrambling to rebuild alternatives. Canada's enhanced role through this merger gives Washington, Tokyo, Brussels, and Seoul a partner they desperately need. And it gives Ottawa far more influence in shaping the next generation of green and digital supply chains. But this is not just about minerals. It is about identity. For years, Canadians have debated what economic sovereignty should look like. Some feared that foreign investment could erode domestic control. Others argued that global partnerships were essential for growth. This merger resolves that debate in a uniquely Canadian way. Attract outside capital, keep decision-making power at home, and tie corporate success directly to national interest. Prime Minister Carney's broader agenda, from AI infrastructure to critical minerals to trade diversification, is about repositioning Canada within a turbulent world. The country is no longer waiting for Washington to choose cooperation. It is building policy around the assumption that the U.S. may remain unpredictable, especially under Trump. Joly's message in this interview fits that logic perfectly. If the U.S. becomes less reliable, then Canada must become more self-sufficient, and that is exactly what this deal accomplishes. The Vancouver headquarters is a symbol, but it is also a structure. It means economic decisions affecting global mining markets will now be made from Canadian soil. It means talent and innovation will cluster in Canada, and it means the country has its own corporate champion at a time when champions matter more than ever. It also suggests a cultural shift inside Canada's political class, a growing acceptance that competing globally requires ambition, assertiveness, and a willingness to shape markets rather than simply participate in them. The country is stepping into a role it once thought belonged only to larger powers, and the confidence behind this merger shows that Ottawa is prepared to lead, not follow. This merger marks a turning point. Canada has not only protected a key industry, it has elevated it. A $70 billion mining titan, headquartered in Vancouver, operating under Canadian rules and competing on the global stage, is a rare story in this country. It reflects confidence, long-term thinking, and a willingness to assert national interest even when global forces push in other directions. In a world of mineral wars, tariff wars, and political pressure, Canada has chosen a path of strategic independence. The question now is whether this new Canadian giant becomes the anchor of a broader industrial revival or the opening chapter of a new era where Canada shapes the North American economy instead of merely reacting to it. Either way, the message is unmistakable. Canada is no longer playing small.
Tech stocks represent almost half of the value of all American stocks. And American stocks, by value, represent more than half of all stocks on the planet. Whoa! Are we putting too much money into this? Is the AI bubble about to burst?
Here's the truth no one in Washington wants to say out loud. If the US AI bubble pops, it won't just take down Silicon Valley, it could send shockwaves through the entire American economy. And at a moment when President Donald Trump is betting his second-term economic story on soaring tech valuations and AI hype, Canada is quietly building something far more durable. Real power, real resources, real national sovereignty.
Stocks and AI, because, and this is crazy, more than a third of stock value on America's main stock index, the S&P 500, comes from just 7 tech companies, all heavily invested in AI.
CBC's investigation recently posed a blunt, almost unsettling question. If the AI bubble pops, will the whole U.S. economy go with it? The concern isn't simply academic. Over the last 3 years, since the launch of GPT 3.50, American markets have been climbing one monumental wave. But a closer look reveals that nearly 1/3 of the entire S&P 500's value now comes from just 7 companies, almost all riding the AI surge. NVIDIA has become the face of this concentration. Its chips power roughly 90% of the world's AI systems, its valuation has skyrocketed past several $1 trillion, and its
its influence is so dominant that its stock performance alone can move global markets. But behind the scenes, the company has been engaging in what analysts call circular investments, pouring billions into AI firms that then use that money to turn around and buy NVIDIA's chips. Goldman Sachs now estimates that up to 15% of NVIDIA's sales next year could come from this closed financial loop. Meanwhile, American tech giants have been borrowing heavily, issuing record volumes of corporate bonds to keep up with the exorbitant costs of new data centers, facilities that, according to recent reporting, now cost more to build than all other U.S. manufacturing projects combined. These centers require staggering amounts of electricity, cooling, land, and infrastructure, yet many of the companies behind them continue to lose money at breathtaking speed. OpenAI, for example, is forecasted to lose more than $70 billion over the next 3 years, even as its valuation approaches $500 billion. All of this raises a simple, uncomfortable question. How long can the U.S. economy ride a wave built almost entirely on expectations rather than profits?
President Trump routinely points to the stock market as proof of American strength. But peel back the surface, and it becomes clear that the market's resilience depends overwhelmingly on a handful of tech giants. If AI spending slows or investor optimism fades, the repercussions will be felt across the entire economy. This isn't just about a volatile sector. It's about the foundational role that tech now plays in America's financial system. As one analyst put it, tech stocks aren't just driving the market, they are the market. The AI sector also carries a paradox that traditional industries don't face. The more customers these companies gain, the more money they lose. Every query costs energy. Every model update requires thousands of new chips. Every training run demands massive capital outlays. The entire industry is built on the assumption that profitability will eventually arrive, somehow, someday, through a breakthrough in automation or artificial general intelligence. But investors are beginning to wonder how long they can subsidize the promise.
This is where Canada's story becomes compelling. While the United States doubles down on AI speculation, Canada is grounding its future in assets that generate lasting value. Ottawa is expanding a clean energy grid that already sits at 85% emissions-free. Provinces are building high-voltage transmission links to move power across regions. New LNG corridors are emerging on both coasts. Critical mineral mines are being fast-tracked through the Major Projects Office. And Canada is deepening partnerships across Asia, the Middle East, and Europe to diversify trade away from an increasingly unpredictable United States. This contrast could not be sharper. The U.S. AI sector consumes electricity at a pace that utilities across multiple states now warn is unsustainable. Some regions are facing energy shortages, construction delays, and grid instability. Canada, by comparison, has decades of surplus hydroelectricity, vast potential for wind and nuclear, and the ability to export power-intensive products the world actually needs. When Prime Minister Mark Carney calls Canada an energy and resource superpower, it isn't rhetoric. It is a statement rooted in geography, engineering, and global demand.
There is a geopolitical dimension here that often gets overlooked. Trump's second-term strategy, his tariffs, his pressure on allies, his America First negotiations all hinge on the U.S. economy staying strong enough to absorb the blowback. But if the AI bubble even partially deflates, that leverage collapses. A 10% correction in tech could wipe out trillions in market value. A deeper drop would push the United States toward recession. And because tech makes up nearly half the value of American equities, the shock would cascade through pensions, banks, and global markets. Trump needs the AI surge to hold. He needs the Magnificent Seven to keep climbing. He needs investors to believe the future payoff will justify today's extraordinary spending. But the fundamentals tell a different story. AI models age quickly. Chips become obsolete within a few years, and the infrastructure decays faster than any traditional industry. That is not a stable foundation. It is a pressure point waiting for a trigger.
And this is where Canada's national confidence is rising. Canada's strength is rooted not in speculation, but in tangible value: vast natural gas reserves, strategic mineral deposits, immense hydro capacity, emerging Arctic trade routes, and a clean power industrial base that companies around the world want to tap into. These are assets that don't burst or deflate because they aren't tied to investor psychology. They are tied to physical demand. While Trump leans on the Magnificent Seven, Canada is building coalitions with South Korea, the UAE, Asian nations, Japan, and the European Union. The U.S. is concentrating risk. Canada is distributing opportunity. If the American AI gamble falters, Canada becomes one of the safest, most stable, most energy-rich economies in the Western world, and the global market will notice.
There is an even deeper implication. If the AI bubble weakens, Trump's political model weakens with it. His tariff threats lose power. His economic narrative loses credibility. His ability to pressure allies diminishes. A market crash wouldn't just shake Wall Street, it would shake the geopolitical hierarchy of North America. The question that will define the next decade isn't whether AI will change the world. It will. The question is whether the payoff arrives before the correction. If it arrives, the United States will soar. But if the correction hits first, America will face an economic shock unlike anything since 2008. Canada isn't waiting for that answer. It is building a resilient future now, one rooted in clean power, critical minerals, diversified trade, and real assets that don't evaporate when a bubble bursts. In a world obsessed with prediction, Canada is preparing for reality, and that may be the smartest move of all.
Canada and the United States had a relationship built up over decades that the U.S. decided unilaterally to change. They didn't consult us. This wasn't a discussion, negotiation. They unilaterally changed it. We're not even going to sign a good deal. We're going to sign a great deal for Canada. And yes, we can give ourselves more than the Americans can take away.
Prime Minister Mark Carney just did what many Canadians have quietly wanted from their leader for years. He looked straight into the camera on one of the biggest media platforms in the country and said out loud what most politicians only whisper behind closed doors. During a tense and unusually candid interview with Toronto Life, Carney exposed the way Donald Trump pressures Canada, how the relationship has shifted permanently, and why this country must now stand on its own feet like never before. It was calm, it was controlled, and yet it felt like the verbal equivalent of a thunderclap. This was Carney at his sharpest, not angry, not emotional, but absolutely immovable. And in doing so, he delivered a message that resonated with millions across the country. Canada is not a junior partner. Canada is not a bargaining chip, and Canada is definitely not anyone's 51st state. The interview landed at a tense moment in Canada-U.S. relations, with Trump's second-term White House expanding tariffs and reshaping cross-border trade. New duties, including the 25% tariff on medium and heavy-duty trucks that took effect on November 1st, have already hit Ontario's auto sector and pushed the Bank of Canada to downgrade growth forecasts. Against this backdrop, Carney sat down with Toronto Life and spoke with unusual candor. He revealed that he and Trump text directly, describing late-night messages written in all caps and the president's habit of applying pressure at every opportunity. Carney emphasized that Trump negotiates by pushing hard on leverage points, something Canada must understand but no longer accept as normal. Then came the line that has already gone viral across Canadian social media. When Carney was asked about Trump's repeated jokes that Canada should one day become America's 51st state, the Prime Minister did not flinch. His answer was simple, firm, and delivered with the kind of national confidence that stays with you long after you hear it. Never, never, ever.
We are not the state there. He wishes that we would be part of the United States. And as I said in the Oval Office when he said, never say never, I said, never, never, ever.
Carney's interview marks a turning point, not just between him and Trump, but in how Canada sees itself in relation to its massive neighbor. For nearly 4 decades, from the 1980s free trade era to the early 2020s, Canada and the United States grew closer and closer, building supply chains, integrating industries, and relying on the assumption that the border was no longer a political fault line, but an economic bridge. Carney made it unmistakably clear that those days are over. The United States, he said, unilaterally changed the relationship. They did not consult Canada, they did not negotiate the shift, they simply imposed it. And that means Canada has to adapt. According to Carney, 85% of Canadian trade remains tariff-free, the lowest average tariff exposure of any country trading with the U.S., but the era of automatic goodwill is gone. Canada must now negotiate from a position of strategic self-interest, not nostalgia for a friendlier past. This is not anti-American sentiment. This is Canada waking up to reality. Carney is effectively telling Canadians that reliance is no longer a strategy. Resilience is. And the sooner Canada builds its own economic engine, housing, energy, AI, ports, manufacturing, the sooner it can negotiate with the U.S. as an equal rather than a dependent.
One of the most striking parts of the interview was how Carney described Trump's style without ever resorting to insult. He acknowledged Trump's skill, his experience, and his understanding of power. But through understated and diplomatic language, Carney revealed exactly how Trump operates: identify a pressure point, hit it hard, and keep pushing until the other side feels the squeeze. Carney's response is a contrast in leadership styles. Trump pressures, Carney prepares. Trump improvises, Carney strategizes. Trump sends all-caps texts in the middle of the night. Carney builds 25-year plans for national housing, clean energy, and industrial independence. The interview exposed not only Trump's behavior, but also Canada's new posture, steady, disciplined, and unwilling to be knocked off balance. And that is why the never, never, ever line landed so powerfully. Carney didn't just reject the idea of Canada being absorbed by the U.S. He rejected the mindset of inferiority that Trump's rhetoric relies on. It was a sovereignty moment, one that reminded Canadians of the quiet strength embedded in the national character. Beneath the political tension, Carney tapped into something deeper, a sense of national pride that often goes unstated. He pointed out that Canada is one of the most admired countries on Earth, a place people choose, not a place that needs validation from any foreign president. By highlighting Canada's diversity, stability, and social generosity, Carney reframed the conversation away from Trump's bravado and toward Canada's values that cannot be traded, bought, or bullied. This is why the interview resonated so intensely. It wasn't about attacking the U.S., it was about defending Canada, and doing so with the confidence of a country that knows exactly who it is.
Carney also used the interview to outline his long-term vision. He described a country preparing for the largest nation-building era in a generation. 65,000 new homes in Downsview, new transit links, massive clean energy projects, a national industrial strategy built around AI, and partnerships across Asia and Europe to reduce economic dependence on America. This is not rhetorical flourish. This is a plan shaped by necessity. As U.S. tariffs become more unpredictable and global rivalries intensify, Canada needs to diversify, innovate, and build, not react. Carney's comments make it clear that Canada's future strength will come from its ability to chart its own path rather than follow the gravitational pull of American politics.
Carney's interview was not a spectacle, it was not a rant, it was the opposite, a calm articulation of sovereignty at a moment when Canada needed clarity more than comfort. By exposing the pressures from Washington, naming the reality of a changed relationship, and reminding Canadians of their own national identity, Carney delivered one of the most important political messages of his premiership. The question now is whether Canada can move fast enough to match the scale of this new era, to build the housing, energy systems, technology sectors, and trade partnerships that will secure its future. Trump will continue to apply pressure. The U.S. will continue to act in its own interest. But Canada, for the first time in a long time, seems ready to respond on its own terms. And after watching Carney on that stage, one thing is clear. This is not a country that bends. This is a country that builds.